without further ado, I will start and be judged on the results. So the three things I want to talk about are basically these three problems, and mostly I will spend time on the first one, which is to look a bit more about the interactions between effort and confidence, and what it says about the status of effort relative to metacognition. Is it a causal influence or a part of metacognition, or is it metacognitive itself in some respects? So that's the type of clarification that I will mostly talk about. And then I wanted to see why it has implications and why we should care about it regarding two other issues. One is one that has been mentioned, and Olivier has written about it, is the reason we value effort. Both in ourselves and in others. And the third one is something that interests me as well relative to metacognition, is the signaling of effort. Like, why do we put on some funny faces when we actually make efforts? So that's the three is actually quite new, but I thought I would gather some of your thoughts about this actually. So in the talk, I will not distinguish between physical and mental effort per se. I know that there's debates, but in many of the metacognitive experiments, it's actually blended, and so the difference doesn't come up. But that's, I realize, abstracting away from some difficulties. In the background, why my work is dealt with effort or crossed effort? Well, mostly because I've done some work on the metacognition of touch, because I was interested in basically what we call the St. Thomas effect. That why would people have tendency to seek certainty through touching things, even when they can see things? So Thomas famously sees Christ, but in the biblical story, but still, to be sure, to have more confidence, would want to touch his body. And this is actually a phenomenon that we see elsewhere. This is on the top, a phenomenon that Mike Pence, the former vice president, exhibited when visiting the NASA. And you can see that he felt compelled to make sure that this equipment was there. And we see it in museum many times. People touch things that they're not supposed to touch. And it's also a component of compulsive disorders, that people tend to touch to check more often to gain certainty. So that's some work that we have been doing, and we have published now one paper, and one is under review, looking at basically this phenomenon in the sense of touch, where I will go back here to the full, where we presented people with a series of illusions. It's a well-known inverted T illusion, where basically people tend to see the vertical bar as being longer than it really is when presented with an horizontal bar. And what we did is to present a series of such illusions, ranging from cases where it was very easy to see that the vertical bar was shorter than the horizontal one, or very easy to see that it was longer, with various other ambiguous stimuli. So what you see here is basically the series of the 5th stimuli we presented, and we can here manipulate the ambiguity. So if you're in the middle case, it's a case where it's very difficult to know whether the vertical bar is shorter or longer. People were actually at chance. This is the maximum ambiguity that they can have. And on both sides, you can find things that are difficult to judge as longer or shorter. What's nice about this task is that it's not a task where touch of vision has an obvious advantage. It's an illusion. It works in both modalities. And you can actually match the performance quite well in the two modalities. You can ask people to do it visually and touch. In both cases, we ask people to tell us not only whether the vertical bar was longer or shorter, but how sure they were of their decision. And surprisingly enough, you see the result on the upper right part. When things become very ambiguous, when we are on the 0, it's the maximum ambiguity, the cases where people really cannot say whether it's really shorter or longer. they tend to report a comparatively higher confidence in these decisions that feel like guesses. Whereas on the other hand, when they're in less difficult or less ambiguous cases, they tend to report comparatively higher confidence in vision. So we have now replicated this elsewhere. It seems that we have this sort of relative higher confidence in touch, especially when things are doubtful, which is really close to the Thomas effect that I just described. And we're trying to understand why we have this phenomenon. But here, one hypothesis that we have been pushing is that the difference between looking at these two bars or touching them provide people with a different sense of the effort they are putting in collecting evidence. Of course, you're moving your eyes when you're looking at something, but you don't feel that this is a big effort. Whereas if you're moving your hands, you're actually feeling that you're doing something. You feel much more agentive and putting some effort in the collection of evidence. But the question, the normative question that one can have here is, should effort have something to do here with confidence? So if we are looking for this link between putting more effort in tactile haptic perception leading to more confidence, what should we say already about the link between this effort and confidence? So that's the entry into the problem. And other people have actually looked a bit into these questions, and usually more using like purely visual tasks. I don't know how many people are familiar with classic metacognitive confidence tasks, so I will explain briefly. But similarly, what you have are usually perceptual tasks where the perceptual difficulty is manipulated. So for instance, random dump stimuli, which can be absolutely random or very correlated. So it's very easy to say whether the dots are going upwards or downwards. And then you can have all the intermediate stages that make it more or less difficult to detect the signal from the noise. And what you can do in this type of task is measure both how well people are performing, their actual success rate for a given level of difficulty, but also ask them to assess how sure they are of their response. So let's say you were in a case where a type of trial where people tend to be 75% correct in their response in detecting that the dots are going upwards. And what you would expect normatively if they're good in metacognition is for them to be 75% sure on a 0 to 100 scale that they are doing well, because that's their performance. So that's what is usually measured in metacognitive task. And as I said, there is a way in which we can understand why there is an ideal link between these things. Your performance can be reflective in your degree of confidence in a way that is normatively appropriate, even if people tend to be less than perfect and be usually a bit more confident than they're actually performing. So the question now is what happens with effort, and there are several studies, but mostly one which has been published recently in Cognition by Turner and colleague, which shows that actually the effort that people are putting in responding in that case to this type of visual task, that is the amount of effort they have to produce to press the button to enter their response, feeds into their levels of confidence. The more effort they push on the button with, the more confident they are. I mentioned their study because it's nicely, the amount of effort they put on the button was varied from trial to trial. Therefore, it could not have been because of the expected effort that people were having from the previous trial. So every time they discovered how much they had to push on the button. So it's really this this idea that the perceived effort fits into people's confidence in a way that looks, in that case, not very rational, because that has nothing to do with the quality of their performance, right? But the question is whether this kind of trick tells us something more normatively appropriate in a case in which the effort, the perceived effort we are investing in performing a whole task. And in normal environment, we're not pressing buttons for which the effort varies randomly on a trial to trial basis, whether there is actually a normative link that can be rescued for this influence of perceived effort on confidence. And I actually think there is, if we grant certain assumptions. One is the fact that the perceived effort should be normally capturing the actual effort we are putting in the task and the relevant effort we are putting in solving the problem at hand. In that case, it was not relevant, but this is the type of trick that psychologists play. So we can see that if this arrow between actual and relevant effort and perceived effort holds, and if the actual effort that we're relevantly putting in solving the problem also translate into a higher success rate. If we're trying harder, then we're succeeding more, if that's the general assumption or the task specific assumption that holds. Then you can rescue the fact that the influence of perceived effort on confidence is actually appropriate, because it is giving you a shortcut on your success rate via these two assumptions. So normatively, it's not absurd to have this type of link. But of course, what we know is that the assumptions, a bit in the same way in which our confidence does not reflect or actual performance. We have mentioned that actually the perceived effort is not a perfect capture of the actual effort we are putting in or the relevant effort, and therefore these assumptions fail to obtain. But from a should perspective, it still holds. In a nutshell, what we can say is that insofar as perceived effort reflects actual effort, which is allocated relevantly to the task, and as far as actual effort translates into a performance benefit, and we have no other defeatures, like we don't have direct feedback that actually we're making more effort, but it doesn't change anything to our performance, for instance, we could have some other indication that this is the case. But in the absence of such defeatures, I would argue that we're actually justified in feeling more confident in our task achievement when we feel we have put more effort in solving the task. So it's a causal influence, but eventually there's a rational influence here to be had. Now, to be clear here, like stating that perceived effort is, in that sense, a justified source of information for metacognitive confidence is strict. It is compatible, but it's not a necessity argument that perceived effort is therefore a causal ingredient, or in a strong sense, a constituent of confidence. It could be simply a random causal influence or a contingent causal influence on confidence, and it's not become metacognitive or part of metacognition per se for the reason I've just described. Granting also that perceived effort reflects actual effort doesn't mean that perceived effort is itself a metacognitive reflection of actual effort. Nothing here that I've said from the evidence actually entails that. So why do I say that we can still treat effort as a metacognitive currency and not just a causal influence on metacognition? Well, some people have ventured arguments by analogy, and this is a very recent paper from educational psychologists Scheiter and Hall. And they argue that actually when we see how people infer the amount of effort that they are putting in a task, in the mental task in that case, and how they judge other performance in learning, for instance, we can see the same time of biases. So there is a sort of analogy here between the two. And they argue that this is sufficient to treat or sense of perceived effort or reflective effort as metacognitive. It's the argument by analogy that maybe we can go back to. I don't think it's a strong argument per se. It just gives you a sense that these things are debated. The better argument I think we can put is actually to add what I call the online confidence effort regulation components, to say that we have reasons to include effort within the metacognitive system. Now, I go back to this boxological diagram about how effort fits into confidence. And one thing that needs to be said is that actually retrospective confidence is only part of our metacognitive assessments. The reason why we are capable of saying after our response whether we did well or not is because of other components, that the online metacognitive monitoring of our performance, which involves sometimes expectations. We see the task and we expect whether it will be difficult or not. I look at all these dots and I think, oh my God, this is going to be hard. And this will be part of my final assessment of my confidence in my achievement. It can bias it one way or the other. It's also linked to the way in which, and there's many studies looking at that, various properties of how the evidence or the problem solving is actually happening during the task is shaping our retrospective confidence. What is more, and we know this from more the social psychology, the type of overall confidence we have in our abilities also shapes how finally confident we will be in our performance. There is unfortunately evidence, for instance, like for math, that there are gender differences into the general metacognitive idea about how capable one is in math between men and women or boys and girls, that biases the retrospective confidence on a trial-to-trial basis. So if we have this broader picture of what the metacognitive assessment rests on, then I think we can see that what will happen is that as we are processing our certainty that we are doing well based on this component, this will determine how much effort we decide to put in the task. And one clear thing here is that by contrast with the previous loop that I've described, or the previous influence in which the more effort I perceive I'm putting in the task, the more confidence I am retrospectively that I did well, this regulatory loop is in the opposite direction. That is, the more confidence as I am performing the task, based on these properties of evidence or my background confidence about my ability or difficulty of the task, the more certain I am that I will be doing well, the less effort I feel I should put in that task. So there is a metacognitive regulation of effort that passes through these various components. So as I said beforehand, what we had is from this studies on the role of effort and retrospective, confidence, I don't know why evidence was there, it doesn't imply much about the status of effort regarding metacognition. I still think that this broader picture shows that effort monitoring is actually a key part of the system through which performance is metacognitively monitored, especially before we actually reach the decision and when we don't have feedback. And this is actually compatible with work that has been just published by Leon Deniso in value-based decision-making and confidence, which is an interesting aspect because that's a case where we can't have external feedback. It's like when you choose a snack, for instance, how sure you are that you chose the right snack is not something that can be given to you by the external world. And here, basically, it's part of a system that shows that goes in the opposite direction of the sort of effort influence on confidence. That is, the more confidence what is that one is in a good way to success, the less effort one is entitled to invest. And I think this is a rational regulation that is happening that keeps us being rational investor of effort. So that's the general argument for fitting effort in the general metacognitive regulation system. And now I want to say a bit more about the implication for the value of effort and the signaling. So as I think Olivier said this very well in several papers, we have this sort of problem of the value of effort, that effort seems to be aversive per se. We are losing resources, but it doesn't feel that good sometimes also, and yet we tend to value it in ourselves and in others. And there is a even more specific version of the problem, which is why do we tend to value effort other relevant aspects which actually lead to which should lead to credit and valuing, such as success or ability. And here, when someone succeeds because they've put a lot of effort in doing something, we actually feel that this is even more valuable than if they had just succeeded by luck or just because they are talented. So we have this extra value of effort, which makes the problem even more acute. And I think especially the valuing of effort over ability is something that we might question. Maybe it's cultural, there's a kind of Protestant ethics there that you should sweat for your bread. But I think there is something actually more substantial here, because what you have in the term of relations between effort and success can be indeed that the more effort you put, the higher probability you are of succeeding. But clearly the cause here is in yourself. So it's explained why we don't value succeeding by luck that much. The difference with ability is a bit more tricky, because it also is supposed to lead to a higher probability of success if you're talented in something. It's also originating in yourself. But ability is something which is more stable and which less directly involve your online control at the moment of exercise. Effort is clearly something via this metacognitively regulated system that depends on you monitoring your performance appropriately, including via having a good calculation of how sure you are that you will succeed. So it's immediately dependent on you, and it's immediately dependent on you being a good metacognizer in a sense. So I think that to address partly, I'm not saying this is the only reason we value effort, but I think there is a relation between the value we put there and the fact that this is something which is caused by us. But by contrast with ability, especially, it's something which is immediately and normally, if well invested, should be corresponding to an accurate regulation by the agent. So that's why we can think that putting the appropriate amount of effort is something that is valuable. This leads us to the third and final part on the signaling of effort. So these are 4 phases, and I would ask you, if we were not at a workshop talking about effort, what kind of emotions you would have inferred from this type of phases, but probably more anger, despair, and fury or something like that. And actually the first one is a phase linked to anger and emotional stimuli that are used in experiments, but the 3 other ones are phases provided by athletes putting a lot of physical effort. So I have had a lot of fun actually going to the literature on looking at the phases of efforts, going back to 1904 paper by Ted Mackenzie, where he himself, this is what you were doing as a scientist in 1904, he actually did build these clay figures to show the difference between violent effort, breathlessness, and advanced fatigue. And the whole paper is a delight to read. It's like a small essay on that. So I had a lot of fun. But there's a lot of other studies that have been done since on the face of effort, measuring frowning activity, why we clench our teeth, and why we stop breathing, for instance, which, if you think about it, it's a bit strange, right? Because you're putting a lot of effort, so you should get a lot of oxygen in, and on the contrary, people hold their breath. So breathlessness is something interesting for the face of effort. But what is clearly the case is both in physical effort, and here I'm sorry, I'm skipping through the empirical evidence, but also in mental effort, is that this is not just fully explained by a biological function. So there is a signaling function of these faces that people put. And maybe the clearer case, this is an argument by pictures, is the type of faces that people put when they're solving tasks, including alone. There is no reason to hold your head and frown and do this type of thing. So it seems to be the faces during mental effort are less investigated. So if you know anything about that, I would be very interested. But why should we have this type of things and this sort of self-signaling or social signaling of faces during effort? Well, I think this brings us back to other aspects of this kind of causal involvement of the agent in effort regulation. So we know that also from a third person perspective, causal attribution depends on finding whether the agent is the cause of an event that has happened. And we differentiate between external causes, internal causes, stable and non-stable. So this is the attribution literature, which goes back a long time in the history of psychology. So we differentiate internal and stable causes, abilities, internal and unstable effort, external and stable, like the task difficulty, and external and unstable luck. So people actually, when they judge people, they just look at people performing, they're quite astute at discriminating between these various causal factors into success or failure. What you have as well on top of that is very subtle inferences about which aspects are due to the controllability. And here, blame, and we're shifting now from inferring from what is the cause to what is to blame, is very much linked to what is controlled. So we will not, for instance, we can infer that the cause of the failure was that the task was difficult or the success was due to luck, but we would not blame the agent for that reason. He's not responsible for the difficulty of the task, and he's not responsible for it being lucky. On the contrary, we're very attuned to effort as a locus of attribution, not only of causation, but also responsibility, because it is deeply under the control of the agent. So the lack of effort is especially relevant to blame, because it's a direct controllable cause of failure. The agent could have done otherwise. And this is really crucial to the social attribution of blame and credit. So I think there are good reasons to think that we have, therefore, good deep interest in signaling effort to others as the task goes on. While, because if we do this during the task, independently of the ability or the task difficulty, then that's a very good way of avoiding blame if at the end something happens, something's bad happen, or if things work out well, to gain credit for our success. Even alone, we could say that effort signaling, as we're alone and frowning and doing, is a way to expel guilt and eventually feel more pride if we are succeeding or failing. So there is this signaling value, which I think is the same as the one that people have granted to, I've seen is underlying the emergence of metacognitive skills. So the reason why people think we have conscious monitoring of our subjective uncertainty is because it helps us socially to adjust our performance with others, but also crucially in sometimes has help. So in a non-verbal way, young children are capable of monitoring their uncertainty and turning for help when they feel they're not certain of doing well. And in the same way, you have this social communicative function of effort, because if you see me putting a lot of effort and frowning a lot as I'm trying to achieve something, you will come to the rescue and help. So that's a bit, again, an argument here by analogy, but I think this integration of effort into the metacognitive system combines with this social function of metacognitive monitoring. So I come to the conclusion, and these are more general pointers where the research program is going, but I hope I have at least provided some arguments in favor of showing that effort is traded with confidence within this metacognitive regulatory system, and that therefore we have more than an argument by analogy to say that the perception of effort is actually the way in which this metacognitive regulation takes place, and therefore should be part of metacognition. But also show why this is connected to the value that we put in effort, and eventually the reasons why we have a sense of effort, the same reasons why we have metacognitive awareness of our own certainty, that is, it helps with social interaction. So thank you for your attention, and thanks to everybody in the group and elsewhere who have helped with the research.